There is a version of Cinderella where the stepsisters have their eyes pecked out by doves at the wedding. Not as punishment in a dream sequence or anything like that. At the wedding, in front of the guests. That is how the story ends. I bet you were not told that version, were you? You were told a version where they are merely embarrassed, and Cinderella is gracious, and everyone moves on. Someone made that choice. Someone looked at the original ending and decided you shouldn't have it. Tonight, we are going to find out who and why, and just how much of what you think you know has been quietly, deliberately, and methodically removed. Welcome back to Illuminated Infamy. I'm Mark Tyson, your slightly dangerous professor, and tonight we are talking about forbidden stories. Not forbidden in the sense of underground manuscripts locked in Vatican vaults, though we will get there, but forbidden in a more insidious sense. Stories that were told to millions of children, generation after generation, that had already been stripped of everything the original tellers considered essential. The fairy tale, as you know it, is an edited document. And before we are done, you are going to understand exactly what was edited out, who edited it, and why the original versions were considered too dangerous to survive. Let's start with the names everyone knows. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, German academics, linguists, folklorists. In 1812, they published the first edition of what they called Kinder- und Hausmärchen, Children's and Household Tales. You know it as Grimm's fairy tales. Here is what the history books tend to gloss over. The Grimm brothers did not invent these stories. They collected them, which sounds innocent enough until you understand what happened next. Between 1812 and 1857, they published 7 editions of that collection. And with each edition, the stories changed. Systematically, in one consistent direction. They got cleaner. The violence was reduced. The sexuality was removed entirely. Biological mothers who committed terrible acts became stepmothers. Morality became tidier. Endings became more comfortable. This was not accidental. The Grimm brothers were operating in a specific cultural moment. A rising German nationalism that wanted folktales to represent an idealized, wholesome German character. The stories needed to be suitable for children. Yes, but more than that. They needed to be suitable for a particular image of what German domestic life was supposed to look like. So they edited, and edited again. And what we received, what got passed to Disney and to Hollywood, and to every bedtime story ever told in the Western world, was the 7th edition. The most sanitized version, the one that had been wiped clean across 45 years of deliberate revision. Let's look at what they were scrubbing. The 1812 first edition of Snow White has one significant difference from every version you have ever seen. The villain is not the stepmother. The villain is Snow White's biological mother. Read that again. In the original text, it is Snow White's own mother who orders her death out of jealousy. It is her own mother who commissions the huntsman. It is her own mother who brings the poisoned apple. By the 1819 second edition, the biological mother had been replaced with a stepmother. The change was made, scholars believe, because the concept of a mother genuinely wanting her child dead was considered too psychologically disturbing. Here's the problem with that reasoning. The original story was not a children's story. It was a folk tale passed between adults, carrying inside it a genuine and ancient anxiety about maternal jealousy, about what happens when a mother's beauty and a daughter's youth exist in the same house. That anxiety is real. It exists in psychology literature. It existed in households across Europe for centuries. The original story was a container for that fear. The edited version replaced it with a safe fiction, a wicked stepmother, a figure who is evil by nature and by role, so that the actual family dynamic could be ignored entirely. What was lost is not just a plot detail. What was lost is the reason the story existed. The 1812 Rapunzel is, by the standards of its time, explicit. The prince visits Rapunzel in the tower repeatedly. They are alone together. night after night. And in the 1812 text, the way the enchantress discovers what has been happening is not that she sees the prince. It is that Rapunzel, speaking without thinking, asks her why her dress is becoming tight around her waist. She is pregnant. That is the original revelation. That is how the secret comes out. By 1819, that detail was gone. In the revised version, Rapunzel naively mentions that the enchantress is much heavier to pull up than the prince is. The pregnancy, and everything it implies about what had been happening in that tower, was simply removed. What remains without it is a story that makes considerably less sense. Why is the enchantress so furious? In the sanitized version, there is a vague implication of betrayal and deception. In the original, the fury is proportionate. It is specific. It is human. The edited version is a story with the motivation cut out. Now back to those eyes. The Grimm version of Cinderella, which is distinct from the Perrault French version most people know, the one with the glass slipper and the pumpkin carriage. The original version does not have a fairy godmother. Cinderella's dead mother communicates to her through a hazel tree planted on her grave. The magic comes from grief and from the dead. And the ending, the actual original ending, involves the stepsisters attempting to fit into the golden slipper. And at the wedding procession, doves descend and peck out their eyes, one eye on the way to the church, one eye on the way back, leaving both sisters permanently blind as punishment for their cruelty. This ending survived the sanitization process for longer than you might expect. But over time, particularly as the story moved into the 20th century and eventually into the hands of film studios, it was softened, then removed, then replaced with nothing, an absence where a consequence used to be. The original story was a morality tale with actual consequences. The edited version is a wish fulfillment fantasy with no consequences at all. Those are not the same story. They do not teach the same lesson. They do not carry the same meaning. Because the Grimm brothers, for all their editing, were not the origin point. They were already working from sources. Folk tales they collected from informants, many of them educated middle-class women, not illiterate peasants as the mythology suggests, who were themselves passing on stories that had been in circulation for a long time. The question is, how far back does the original, unedited version go? The answer is further than most people realize and considerably darker. In 1634, a Neapolitan poet and soldier, Giambattista Basile, published a collection of 50 folk tales. He called it Lo Conto degli Conti, the Tale of Tales, known as the Pentamerone. It is the oldest known written collection of European fairy tales, predating the Grimm brothers by nearly 200 years. Scholars know the Grimms drew from it. It is the document that Grimm's fairy tales is a cleaned-up version of. Basile's collection contains recognizable versions of Cinderella, Rapunzel, Snow White, and Sleeping Beauty. The Sleeping Beauty story is the one that should concern you most. In Basile's version, it's called Sun, Moon, and Talia. A nobleman's daughter, Talia, falls into a death-like sleep after a flax splinter pricks her finger, fulfilling a prophecy. She is laid out in a country estate. A king, out hunting, finds her. He does not wake her with a kiss. He assaults her while she is unconscious, then leaves. Talia gives birth to twins, Sun and Moon, still unconscious. One infant sucks the splinter from her finger, waking her. She finds herself alone with 2 children. She has no memory of conceiving. The king returns, falls in love with her. But he already has a wife who discovers the situation and orders Talia's children to be cooked and served to the king. This is the story that Sleeping Beauty is descended from. Not distantly, directly. The core architecture, the sleeping woman, the man, the children, the jealous queen is all there. The Perrault version in 1697 replaced the assault with a kiss and removed the children from the central drama. The Disney version in 1959 removed everything except the sleep and the kiss. What you watched as a child is the third or fourth generation of a story about something that cannot be named in a children's film. The original story was not about romantic love. It was about power, violation, and survival. Here is the important question. Why were these stories told this way in the first place? The academic answer involves Bruno Bettelheim, whose 1976 book, The Uses of Enchantment, argued their darkness serve as psychological function. Children, he argued, use these stories to process genuine fears: abandonment, death, monstrous parents, their own darkness. The sanitized versions, he argued, rob the stories of their therapeutic function. But there is a simpler and older answer. These stories were not originally for children. The fairy tale as a children's genre is a modern invention. The Pentamerone was written for adult aristocrats as entertainment. The tales Grimm collected were told by adults to adults around fires, encoding cultural anxieties about their world: maternal jealousy, assault, disappearing children, stepmothers who resent inherited children. These were not fantasy elements. They were real situations that the stories gave a shape to. When reclassified as children's literature, they had to be made safe, stripping out situations children were supposedly too innocent to understand. The problem is that children are not too innocent. They understand abandonment, jealousy, danger, and the monstrous capacity of adults. They have always understood it. The stories existed in part because children needed language for what they already knew. The sanitized versions gave them prettier language for a safer world that does not exist. One more layer. Charles Perrault, the French writer, published his versions in 1697. He did not create them. He edited them. His versions were polished for an aristocratic audience, with moral tags. His Little Red Riding Hood ends with the girl eaten. No rescue. The wolf wins. Perrault appended a moral. His Bluebeard, a story about a man who murders his wives, ends with the surviving wife inheriting his wealth. These are not children's stories. These are adult political documents wearing the costume of folklore. And they are still closer to the originals than what came later. The stories, you know, animated by the largest entertainment company, are the end product of a 200-year editorial process. Darker became lighter. More complex became simpler. Consequences became comfort. The original stories are not lost. You can read the 1812 Grimm, first edition in translation. You can read Basile's Pentamerone. You can read Perrault's originals with their unsettling morals still attached. What was forbidden was not the texts themselves. What was forbidden was the context. The understanding that these stories were always about something real, that their darkness was a record of actual human experience. And that someone decided, generation by generation, that you were better off not knowing that. The stories were not sanitized because the darkness was false. They were sanitized because it was true.